Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Our guest today is Konrad Jarausch, the Lurcy Professor of European Civilization at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He joins us to discuss his latest book, Broken Lives: How Ordinary Germans Experienced the 20th Century, one of approximately 40 books that he's either written or edited. So I think it would be a waste of time for me to ask you what you do in your free time, because I don't know if such a thing exists. Welcome, thank you, and congratulations on the latest work.
Nice to be here, and I actually managed to do lots of exercise in my free time.
Good for you. I wish I could say the same, and I'm not nearly as productive as you are. So obviously you've written extensively on the topic. So I'm wondering, what's new? What was the new story to tell, and how did you figure out that there was another angle to which look at this period in history?
The new story is what people actually experienced. A lot of academic history is top-down about big decision makers and abstractions, institutions, labor unions, and so on. But ordinary people, that is, people like you and me, they have lives as well, and they interact with big history. Sometimes big history kicks them around. Mm-hmm. And sometimes their collective action actually does the kicking. So it's a kind of a crazy interaction. And this is new because it looks at the people who were born in the 1920s during the Weimar Republic, and then when they were teenagers got to be Nazified, that is, got to be drawn into Hitler's Third Reich. And then when they were just beginning to be young adults, they had to pay for it because more of them got killed than any other age group, because the young men were all at the front, and many of them did not make it, including my father. And the young women were at home and got bombed, and if they were in the East and liberated, in quotation marks, by the Red Army, 2 million of them got raped. So this was not a happy time. And then, of course, the victims of all of this, communists and Jews, had to suffer in prisons, concentration camps, and on the Jewish side, of course, most of the ones that did not make it out got killed in the Holocaust.
When you flip history on its head in this manner and look at it from the bottom up versus the top down, does the story change significantly?
Well, it does in some. For instance, Weimar childhoods were a whole lot more friendly and positive in memory than what we think of the Weimar Republic as a series of crises, one after another, and so on. And then what you find out with the adolescents in the Third Reich is that they were really more enthusiastic about the Nazis than they afterwards admit. Mm-hmm. And so they have kind of
makes sense.
Mixed memories. I mean, they remember the fun they had when they were in the Hitler Youth, and then, of course, they sort of understand that this led to disaster.
Is this type of history, in that regard, because you're relying on memory, any more or less reliable than a traditional top-down view that's document-based or otherwise?
Well, the cute answer is reliable for what?
Well, in other words, how accurate are the memories or the reminiscence?
I'm happy. Actually, it's a diachronic book. It moves on two different levels of events and of memories. And of course, it's written decades after the events.
Yes.
So it is not going to be 100% accurate on the events. And the only way you can do that there is to try to compare a lot of different people with each other. And where their memories overlap and intersect, you can be reasonably sure. And the second dimension, of course, is the memory culture, and that is affected also by intervening public discussions, by movies, by novels, and so on, so that people afterwards, when they look back on their earlier life, they do this intention, especially if their earlier life was in the Third Reich, because then they feel embarrassed about it, and they ask themselves later, how could we have done any of this stuff and still be the same people? And three of the ones that I have in there actually had nervous breakdowns over this issue, because while they were becoming full adults and making careers and building houses, getting married, having children. They were all so busy that they didn't really think too much about what they had done.
They delayed processing all of it?
Yes, and then when they retired and they started to go back and look at some of their letters and stuff, one of them even looked at the diary that she wrote in the Third Reich. Then they began to ask themselves, oh my God, how could I have done any of these things?
Sounds like a cautionary tale about retirement in some way. Let me quantify this for our viewers and listeners. Your cast of characters, if my math is correct, 17 key individuals, and that means you define that as more than 80 mentions in the book, 21 secondary protagonists that have more than 40 mentions in the book, 44 minor individuals, and more than 5 mentions. This is a sprawling, huge cast. How did you select them?
Well, I started actually with people whom I knew personally, because one of the things I wanted to do with the book was to get their stories out. Since they have all passed away in the meantime, I had to go to written versions.
Were they eager to participate or reluctant?
Oh, they were surprisingly eager. I mean, when I then, and then a snowball principle kind of worked. And when I started talking about all of this, people came to me and said, oh, my mother or my father, they wrote something, would you like it? And I said, sure, let me take a look at it. So,
Did you have to leave anybody out? Did you have more referrals than you could possibly include?
A little bit. I mean, you get to the point where the story stabilizes, where you have enough different witnesses talking to you that the witness N+1 witness no longer fundamentally changes anything. And at that point, those people who came to me late in the process didn't get as much coverage as the ones that I started with.
But this was an organic process. You had no preconceived notion of when you'd hit that moment. It just happened. You keep adding to the story, and finally it stabilized, as you called it.
Well, I mean, I wanted to start with just half a dozen, and then I found out that
it wasn't going to be that easy.
No, and half a dozen didn't really cover enough different kinds of dimensions, because you have to make allowances for for place, Prussians versus Bavarians, social class, upper middle class people versus workers, Catholics versus Protestants, pro-Nazis versus anti-Nazis, and then, after 1945, East Germans and West Germans. So, there is a lot of different kind of dimensions in order to make it as representative as I could get it.
Does a common theme or thread emerge among any of the groups? I know you did some breaking down demographically, looking at a certain age versus another age, but are there any common threads that emerge?
Well, I mean, the common threads are, of course, how people responded to the Third Reich, how much they got involved in it themselves, how guilty they were, and then we have a whole sort of range of perpetrators on the one hand, accomplices, or on the next level, and then people who try to get on with their lives. And then we also have a sprinkling of resistance people, in there. So that's the relationship to the Third Reich. When you're talking about the Second World War, it makes all the difference in the world, whether you're male, because you were then fighting in the Wehrmacht, or female, and you were at the home front and got bombed and had other happy things happen to you, or if you were a victim of the Nazis. If you were a communist, you were mostly in penitentiaries, and if you were Jewish, you were mostly in concentration camps or annihilation camps. And so, what you have is group experiences, shared experiences, and you have also tropes of memory, that is, ways in which they then, decades later, if they survive, remember what happened to them.
The way you organize the book is the pre-war childhood, the wartime youth, and then finally the post-war adulthood. I'm going to ask you, I hope this isn't a little gimmicky, but for each of those areas of the book, if you could think of one story that pops to mind as really defining for each of those periods. Start with the pre-war childhood. Is that possible, or am I being a little too glib with that question?
No, I mean, as I said, it depends a lot upon who you were. I mean, one of them became a forester eventually from East Prussia, and he grew up in German it's called a Forsthaus, in a forester's home, and he talks about shooting his first deer and having to migrate through deep snow to school and cross a piece of the Baltic Sea and so on. So you have graphic descriptions. And another one, is an adolescent, is a working class adolescent who does not go to college or the university in Germany, but who is good as being an electrician, in his trade, and then wins some kind of national competition and so on, and also becomes a member of the Nazi Party. And then, when you get to the war, among the men, one of the ones is a composer and organist who sponsored me for my student visa in the United States, and he was a second lieutenant in the war, and a Protestant, not in the Nazi Party, but part of the artillery, and gets shot a couple of times, and then has one leg that is shorter than the other, and if you're an organist, that's a real pain in the neck because you have to be able to reach all of those things, your foot pedals, and so on, And with women, I have one who was a Nazi accomplice, who was married to an SS man, and the father was an SS man, and she was enthusiastically Nazi youth and so on, And then she has a child or two in the war and has to flee from Prague at the end of the war, and the train is so overcrowded that the baby gets thrown into the train through the window and she barely makes it herself onto it, and then her husband from a Russian POW train manages to pry the door open and jump out, and then hike over 1,000 kilometers from Transylvania back to Germany. And when he gets there, he works for the police, and then the local mayor finds out that he was really in the SS, and he tells him, you have 48 hours to get out. And the mayor says, I am a communist, but I'm also a German, so go to West Germany. And then, he starts working on dead horses and stuff to begin with, before he eventually buys a car and becomes a small businessman and so on. So, these, I have just one story after another like that.
Any one of these stories could be the basis of a novel in and of itself. And
Absolutely.
Dozens.
And if Hollywood would be any more intelligent, they would pick real life.
Contact Konrad H if you want to option any of these stories for the film.
They would take real life stories because they're incredible.
Yes. So now the big question out there of why did so many support Hitler? Did you arrive through this work at any answer that satisfies you in trying to come to grips with that question?
Well, a couple of three dimensions are important. One of them is that the Nazis really took young people seriously, and they actually went after them, and they made them believe that they were something special, and that the whole future of the country depended on them. And this was rather cynical because the Nazis knew that grown-ups already had political affiliations, and therefore they were less likely to come along with them and be persuaded. And the young people could be gotten. The second dimension is peer pressure, that once you have a certain number of them, what the young people, especially the young men, were doing was camping and hiking and campfires and war games at night, going and stealing the flags from another group that they knew were somewhere out in the forest at some other end, and whatever, stuff that a lot of young men, boys or whatever, love to do, and so on. And the young women, similarly, were doing things that prepared them for motherhood in the future and so on. I have a bunch of people who had fights with their parents, where their parents said, we will not buy you a uniform, you're not going there. And so they said, oh, we will. And they then, brought the local Nazi leader in, and the parents usually had to cave, because if they did not want to lose their job or whatever, they had then to let the young people go along with it. So that I think, this double mechanism, of the Nazis having really more interest in young people than democratic parties, and so on. So they systematically go after them. and then once there's a certain threshold, the young people themselves pressure other young people because they want to be members of the
Peer
same
pressure,
group.
timeless concept. Do any of the narratives in a significant way challenge conventional wisdom about this period of history, or are they more compatible with what we think about it?
Well, let me just back up for a half a second and
Okay.
say the most difficult people to find were perpetrators because they don't write. That is, accomplices write. And people who then afterwards change their mind about it, they write. And they write in considerable detail about how terrible it was, what they did, and so on. And so, you have a kind of whole range of different opinions, that you can deal with.
The concept of national identity, and if you look at different European nations, there's national pride attached to
Yes.
their past. Not so in the case of Germany. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, well, not only were their lives interrupted and broken, that's the title, by what happened, what they did themselves, to themselves, and what they did to others, but their memories are also broken. Because when you retire, and I'm, getting to the age where I should have retired,
Well, who's to say?
a while ago.
We're glad you're keeping at it.
Then you are thinking about your earlier life more than about the current present and so on, and then there is a tendency to be nostalgic.
Yes.
And to think that, well, snow is always deeper when you had to hike to school,
Mm-hmm.
through it and so on, and that creates a kind of problem for being truthful to yourself. And I think the thing that comes out of this text is really a kind of tension between the actual experiences and the later memories. And I think most books that I know of either work on the level of what happened to these folks, or they work on the level of how do they remember it. But the two things are intimately intertwined. And some of them, I have a sense, are pushing away, what they were into, and some other ones are willing to face up to it. And that makes a kind of insecurity for the public, because it means that not everybody can say hurrah. And if you compare, and please don't get angry at me, the presence of flags in the United States,
Yes.
and national anthems in the churches, in the schools, in sports events, and so on. And if Germans did this, the international community, would...
This is closer to the use of the Confederate flag in the United States.
Yeah.
Where it becomes a point of criticism. So along this lines of national identity, you mentioned in your conclusion that Germany today would be unrecognizable to the ancestors of this imperial ancestors. And you look at Germany today, and Angela Merkel, often viewed as the leader of the Western Alliance in many ways, where others have either abdicated or are faltering. And Germany has become this robust democracy, economically sound, who is in many ways the hope of the EU. Surprise ending to Germany's story in that regard?
Absolutely. It's amazing. Nobody would have believed the turnaround. And some of my critics, of course, also accuse me of being too optimistic about it. But I do remember, I was born on the day of the proclamation of the Atlantic Charter on the 14th of August, 1941. And I don't have any real wartime memories, but I have a lot of immediate post-war memories. And thinking about a broken country, destroyed buildings, starvation, freezing at night, and so on, and just taking the trajectory to the present. Yes, we have problems in the present, the financial crisis, the migration wave, Brexit, and so on. But these all seem to me to be not quite as existential as getting killed or not surviving.
Yeah, Brexit doesn't look half bad compared to the Third Reich.
No, it's a shame, because Britain has a lot of goodwill on the continent, and as a leading country in the EU, is, I think, missing a chance to do something. But then there are also British experiences and British memories that have to do with the world wars and with the Germans, and the Germans are sort of the counterpoint, the bête noire. Winning 2 wars and losing the peace is not something that is very comfortable.
Well, I want to ask you one final question, just because there's a phrase that you wrote, alleged facts are stranger than fiction, which I keep coming back to because it's a fantastic notion. And I wonder, what's an example of that, where the alleged facts were stranger than fiction?
Yeah, I'm stumped right now.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, I love the phrase. I thought it was really evocative and really sets a tone for the way we all remember our own personal history.
Well, it's the difference again of various people's honesty with themselves, and
even if you're attempting to be completely honest, I guess there are limitations of what we can actually remember.
Right.
So much of I find so much of my own personal memories are a function of stories told by elder family members that I've processed in a way where they become my memories, but I couldn't tell you with any certainty that I actually remember them.
And that, when I have a little bit of apnea, breathing problems and so on, I remember being in a cellar being bombed with stuff falling on me, and I have no idea whether or not
if that's a real memory or
I mean, the memory is real, but whether the event is real, and lots of people experienced this event, and I heard about it countless times, but whether I experienced it or not, I can't tell.
Well, fascinating. Well, Konrad Jarausch, thank you for joining us today, and congratulations on yet another great piece of work. What's the next book?
It's called Embattled Europe, and it's a defense of the European model, since there's so much criticism in the United States of what's going wrong in Europe, instead of self-criticism of what's going wrong in the United States. So I think this is a set of topics that need to be addressed.
Well, we'll look forward to it. Thanks again for joining us today. And to those of you watching or listening, the book is Broken Lives. The author is Konrad Jarausch, and we hope that you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again for a future episode. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.